Hey everyone, Adam from Passable Media. Let's have a chat about the modern iterations of Star Trek. Thanks to the Picard trailer, I was lucky enough, and I do genuinely mean lucky enough, to have a much more active comments section than usual last week. And while there was a clear majority looking forward to Picard Season 2, there were also a lot of tirades about how modern Trek isn't real Trek, not my Trek, this isn't Gene Roddenberry's vision, Star Trek is too woke now, and all that jazz. So since I picked up quite a lot of new subscribers last week who were clearly here for the Star Trek content, I thought, why not? I'll take a crack at it. First and foremost, I'm not blind. I can see that the so-called modern interpretation of Star Trek, beginning with the 2009 film simply called Star Trek, heralded the beginning of a significant change for the series and the creation of the Kelvin timeline. It also precipitated the destruction of Romulus in the Prime timeline, which has gone to affect a whole lot moving forwards. So this piece will in part cover the 3 reboot films, Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, plus the 3 currently released new Trek series, Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, and Star Trek Lower Decks. It goes without saying, but if you're watching this after Strange New Worlds, Star Trek Prodigy, or Section 31 are released, I can't help you there, but I'll probably do an update video at the time if it's requested. On screen now, you'll see a quick list of complaints about new Trek that I've gleaned from the comments and the timestamps of where I discuss them. This way you can either jump to what you're interested in or can stay for the entire ramble. Dealer's choice. Woke Trek. This seems like an obvious one to start off with. Here's the rub, everyone. Whether you call it progressive or forward-thinking or humanistic, Star Trek has always tried to be woke. It's fair to say it hasn't always succeeded, but just as Cliff notes, there was a Japanese officer on the bridge in the original series at a time when the Japanese were still distrusted in the US following World War II, and a Russian during the Cold War. The original series also had the first televised interracial kiss between the white captain and a black officer, not to mention that Kirk also had that same black woman on his bridge at a time when that would have been considered strange. Even at this early point in the franchise, Gene Roddenberry had a vision of a time where the differences in race and gender just didn't matter. Even interspecies relationships were hailed as a total non-issue in universe until Enterprise hung a lantern on the discussion by virtue of being earlier on in the timeline. From day dot, the Star Trek universe has been portrayed as staunchly anti-capitalist, with the most capitalist race in the series, the Ferengi, being a clear parody of its extremes, and the Federation being about the most obvious post-scarcity socialist society you could imagine. The Next Generation largely failed at portraying androgyny and gender reassignment in 1992, but an attempt was clearly being made, and the attitude taken was well ahead of its time. It's always tried to walk a line of religious tolerance, even in Sisko, an avowed atheist, dealing with being held up as a Bajoran religious figure. And on the subject of Sisko, he was the first black lead character in 1993, and Janeway the first female lead in 1995. So just shy of 30 years ago, that fairly conclusively blows the woke casting argument away, doesn't it? And that's all not to mention the entire argument of rights for artificial intelligence, shown in The Measure of a Man in The Next Generation and Author in Voyager. Is it truly so strange that 55 years after its inception, Star Trek is just continuing to stay on the forefront of what would be considered progressive politics? Having Seven's burgeoning sexuality change over the course of 20 years, whether she's bisexual or a lesbian hardly matters. Having an engineer and a doctor be a gay couple, having a non-binary character front and centre, changing the sexuality of an alternate timelines character to pay homage to the actor who played the original, having a black female lead, and so on and so forth. TLDR, Star Trek has always been woke, and you just don't like this particular brand of it. The returning cast is old. I honestly don't know what to say to pad the runtime on this one. Picard is a legacy series focusing on a retired Starfleet officer. It's set 20 years after the last movie and only slightly less time has passed in the real world. Patrick Stewart is 80 years old. He is an old man. You people wanted this show in the first place, and now all you do is complain that Picard, Riker and Troy look older than they did 20 years ago. Guess what? They all looked old in All Good Things' future timeline as well. Why are you shocked that time causes people to age? You're the same people who complained that the age-reducing CGI in the Picard and Data scene looked wrong. Would you have preferred that the entire series run with that filter on it? Yes, within the confines of the Star Trek universe, Picard is not particularly old by 24th century human standards. But if you can suspend disbelief for warp cores and tractor beams, I don't think it's asking much to do the same for the advanced age of the protagonist. And as for Q appearing old in the trailer being touted as something being done wrong, I direct you once again to All Good Things, where Q appears old to match Picard. He has always changed his appearance to mess with people or to find common ground with them. He could appear as a ball of light with John Delancey's voice instead, but no doubt there'd be something wrong with that too. TLDR, the actors are older than they were 20 years ago. Why is Picard a robot? He's not Picard anymore. I mean, first of all, he's not a robot. His consciousness was moved into an android body that, as we've established with data over the course of decades, has a neural system almost identical to a human's. More's the point, do you remember how we spent The Next Generation with Data, Voyager with the Doctor, and even more recently in Picard with Daj, Soji, and their people, outlining again and again that they were just as alive as anybody else. And for the same reasons that animals that display pain responses are protected by law, consciousness, sentience. Picard's human body was failing because of an inoperable brain abnormality introduced in, once again, All Good Things. Patrick Stewart was down to do more Star Trek, so rather than pull a fix for the brain abnormality out of nowhere after making it clear that it could not be fixed, they did the next best thing. And best of all, it's functionally exactly the same as the human body, to be in keeping with Picard's wishes, so it literally doesn't matter beyond making him yet more empathetic towards synthetic life. And if empathy isn't Star Trek, I don't know what is. TLDR, android not robot, but it also doesn't matter. They use the film depiction of Picard. The argument here is that action hero Picard from the films is somehow distinct from the talk to resolve your problems Picard shown in The Next Generation. Well, the thing is, even if you argue that this is the case, and it's not, because the only real distinction there is that people don't go to the movies to watch people talk at one another for an hour and a half, so the films had to be more action-orientated, they're the same character. Film Picard is series Picard, just a few years older. In fact, the Picard we see in Picard is far more akin to the talky man from my childhood. Unless we're talking about the character development he received in those films, like his retained antagonism and fear towards the Borg, or his willingness to not just argue with Admiralty, but outright abandon his post if his orders don't sit well with his moral compass, or his closer ties with the Romulans following his clone's coup, in which case, yes, they're using film Picard. Our modern Picard quit Starfleet because they chose to focus their attention inwards and enact anti-synth laws that he disagreed with anyway, rather than help the Romulans escape their impending doom. Which is not to say I wholly disagree with Starfleet's approach in terms of not helping the very last enemy a solo Earth ever fought a war with, and literally a forever foe for the Federation. But as far as our protagonist was concerned, it was wrong. He's blunt, he's curmudgeonly, he's old, but he's also wise and empathetic and willing to spend what he now knows are the final days of his life on a fool's errand. TLDR, he's the same Picard as he's always been. Kurtzman has killed Star Trek. Hyperbolic nonsense. Star Trek's not dead. There are 3 currently running Star Trek shows, Discovery, Picard and Lower Decks. There are also 3 more shows, Prodigy, Strange New Worlds and Section 31 in development, and at least 1 movie. The viewing figures and the stacks of cash piling up don't lie, kids. Star Trek is more alive now than it ever has been in its 55-year lifespan. And you can like or dislike Kurtzman as much as you want to, but the fact of the matter is he is the Star Trek universe's equivalent of Kevin Feige for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. TLDR, Star Trek is more alive than ever. Michael Burnham is a self-insert Mary Sue. Okay, I can't throw words at this one to make it go away. This one's absolutely true. No disrespect to Sonequa Martin Green's acting, I've seen her in other stuff and she's great, but Michael Burnham might just be my least favourite character in all of Star Trek. If you look up fan character insert in the dictionary and you don't see a picture of Michael Burnham smiling smugly at you, it might be time for a new dictionary, and apparently one with pictures, since this turn of phrase would imply that these exist. She is Spock's previously unknown adopted sister. She's a human with a Vulcan's composure. She's the first Starfleet mutineer in history, despite there being statements from characters in the original series that none have ever occurred in Starfleet. She single-handedly caused the Klingon War, proceeded to be just as impossibly important in the Mirror Universe, single-handedly caused the end of the Klingon War, was tangentially responsible for convincing Spock to become friends with Kirk, defeated Control using her mother's incredibly advanced Section 31-backed time travel suit, brought Starfleet morality to a bleak future, defeated the Emerald Chain Leader, and was finally made Captain of Discovery despite her flagrant and outright mutinous repeated derelictions of duty that resulted in her superiors looking foolish for being short-handed when they needed her, to the point where even her best friend dobs her into Saru when push comes to shove. If when people complained about modern Trek they were just spouting off about what an awful main character Michael Burnham is for Discovery, I would be right there with them. And the thing is, her character can be handled better. If she'd have chosen to stay with Book when Discovery made it to the future, or at any point later on when she had clashes with Saru or the Admiralty, becoming a kind of Federation-adjacent scout or mercenary like a Fenris Ranger with no actual rank, all of a sudden, her continued attitude would have made sense for her character's direction. But no, Captain it is. Sigh. TLDR, Michael Burnham is a self-insert Mary Sue. There's no swearing in Star Trek. Well, here's the thing. There is, and there always has been, our primary viewpoint for Star Trek, for the original series, The Next Generation, and the original wave of movies was the flagship. The best of the best. They stuck to the rules. The rules, in this case, being how much you could curse or swear on network television. Bear in mind, what is and isn't swearing varies across regions and time, but while Kirk and Spock hang a lantern on the idea by implying that swearing is a 21st century thing and that they just don't do it anymore, despite a bunch of asses from across the original series, The Next Generation, and DS9 over the years, and repeated exclamations of Klingon bastards from Kirk and son of a bitch from Bones, and Picard choosing merde to avoid the censors. Data made it abundantly clear from his lack of chastisement in Generations that swearing was not unheard of or all that surprising. The movies really opened it up as an option, and by the time we got to Voyager, Janeway quickly introduced us to her two favourite words, damn and hell. Yes, light cursing, even where it's considered so these days, but it's there nonetheless. Data continued to drop the odd swear over the next few years, and then we get to Discovery, and guess what? The censors no longer apply. We have on our hands a much more casual, young crew who get called out for it when they do swear, except by Pike, who seems to find it funny and even joins in. In Picard, it's a different matter entirely. Besides Admiral What's-Her-Face being justifiably apoplectic with Picard's request for a ship and reinstatement, nobody that's swearing is a Starfleet officer. They're talking like people in high-stress situations talk, and even if you might argue that Picard would usually be above all that, he's an old man with days or even hours to live, as if he's going to stand on ceremony. TLDR, yes there is, and there always has been. Star Trek is supposed to be optimistic. This one's a bit more complicated, and is definitely going to be the longest section, but the upshot is that it never really has been. Oh sure, there was a veneer of utopia about the Federation, a post-scarcity socialist society where everyone is treated equally, no conflict, no war, no hunger, no discrimination. Well, guess what? That doesn't make for a good story, so much so that almost every inciting incident in every episode is about that hopeful utopia being broken in some way, often either with the Federation directly doing wrong or as a result of a cultural clash. Few episodes strip the aforementioned veneer off quite as cleanly as The Next Generation's The Drumhead, but several come close. And that was definitely a turning point in the franchise. Admirals are single-minded and bullheaded, every series features either a war or the build-up or cool-down from one, and we're later introduced to latinum, an unreplicatable substance used as currency in a galaxy that supposedly has no need of one. Heck, we spend 2 episodes in an argument over whether or not sentient life forms deserve rights. People often cite DS9's introduction of Section 31, and Enterprise and Discovery's continued use of the concept as a betrayal of Gene Roddenberry's vision, but the damage was done long before that, with Picard being chastised for not using Hugh as a neurological weapon against the Borg. And then of course we have Starfleet signing off on using Odo as a biological weapon against the Founders, or my favourite example in the entire Star Trek franchise, the Maquis. The Maquis as a movement happened because Starfleet hand over control of inhabited Federation worlds to the Cardassians at the end of the war and insist that the people up and leave. And if the episode Journey's End is any indication, they send in ships in force to move them against their will if they don't go willingly. So what we're seeing here is the Federation showing that it truly does take a needs of the many approach, willingly ceding the homes of its citizens because they happen to be on the border worlds rather than within the inner circle of the Federation. And it's clear that it's a bad move because decorated Starfleet officers abandon Starfleet in droves as a result. The Maquis are a lingering presence throughout The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine and Voyager, with Sisko going out of his way to chase them down rabidly and commit war crimes without reproach because of a perceived sense of betrayal. And Janeway's original mission was expressly to take down a Maquis cell by any means necessary. By the last few seasons of Voyager, Chakotay discovers that basically all of their friends are either dead or imprisoned, which tells us that the Federation still hadn't held their hands up to the mistake, even in a post-Dominion War Alpha Quadrant where they could just as easily have insisted it was high time they got their planet back from the weakened Cardassians. Not to bring it back to a previous section or anything, but should we be all that surprised that the Federation weren't willing to help the Romulans when they've got a history of ignoring the suffering of their own people? And yes, using the Icheb torture scene as an example, Picard is a gorier show than we're used to seeing in Star Trek, but besides the blood, we've seen aliens stealing organs before. Heck, we've seen living Borg stripped for parts before as well. I genuinely don't see this as a worthwhile distinction. In fact, touching briefly on a storyline from each of the original series, Balance of Terror in the original series is literally 2 sides of a conflict, the Federation and the Romulans trying morbidly to kill one another to stop prescient information getting back to each other's superiors. The Next Generation has one of the main characters' backstories be that she spent her childhood accosted by rape gangs. DS9 had the subjugation of an entire planet under Cardassian occupation while the Federation had stood by and done nothing. Voyager has the Year of Hell two-parter that showed just how perilously close Voyager always was to outright destruction. And Enterprise, best of all, opened its Xindi arc with the deaths of 7 million people on Earth in an attempted genocide, with the threat of a second attempt should the crew fail in their mission, not to mention Archer's slow descent into inhumane tactics to stay on track. TLDR, Star Trek has only ever been optimistic at surface level. New Trek is terribly written. I think this is a pretty harsh judgment. I understand complaints about a lack of trekking in modern Trek. With the exception of Lower Decks, we're not seeing many Strange New Worlds, at least until Strange New Worlds finally comes out. But that's largely because the change in series lengths these days pushes stories to be more story arc geared, with less filler and less meandering about, all but forcing a tighter, almost laser focus on the core plot of the season. This is a shame, for sure, but that's not really the writer's fault, is it? Now, it absolutely is fair to criticise things already discussed, like Michael Burnham being the most important character in Star Trek ever, like going to the trouble of revisiting the multi-series long unification story arc and then to make the episode all about her family drama instead of, you know, the reunification of the Romulans and Vulcans that you've been hinting at for 20 plus years. Or having a certain cybernetic god creature simply turn and leave when the beacon is turned off at the end of Picard Season 1. Not to flog a dead horse, but if someone repeatedly rang my doorbell for 15 minutes and just as I got to the door handle they stopped, I'd still open the door and check who's there. Or while we're on the subject, shamelessly reusing the plot of Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan for Star Trek Into Darkness rather than, writing something properly new that also acts as an homage. But with that said, there are also some spectacular episodes and decent story arcs in there. The mystery of Soji and Dahj was compelling, as were the politics of a post-Dominion War, post-Romulus Federation. Seeing the Borg neutered and then temporarily restored to a legitimate threat, even in a reduced state, was chilling, as was the entire concept and use of Control as a villain. The much-decried Spore Drive was an interesting way to explore further than the Federation should have been able to at that time. The trip to the future has been a little ham-fisted, for sure, but the way it's weaved in the best aspects of both the Kelvin timeline and Enterprise's temporal Cold War and put a clear full stop on the mirror universe was a brilliant way to start with a fresh slate. Heck, the weaving of Enterprise's backstory into Star Trek Beyond was brilliant, and seeing a slightly different, more advanced Federation from just a small amount of scavenged tech in the Kelvin films was wicked too. And Lower Decks, goddamn if there's ever been a better show to put on in front of new and old fans alike, assuming you also have a sense of humour. I have yet to see it. It expertly pays homage to canon while also being absolutely hilarious, and those people ostensibly in the fanbase arguing that it's Rick and Morty Trek clearly need to get out more. And the vast majority of the short Treks tell a tightly woven tale that's just magnificent. I'll grant that in much the same way as season length affects the direction of the story, we're getting less development for side characters than we're used to in Trek, but we're also used to 20 plus episodes a season for 7 seasons to get to know our command crew intimately, with a focus episode for all of them every season. I think that considering they've got one hand perpetually tied behind their backs, the writing teams are doing a bang-up job. TLDR, not really. Say it's studio interference and call it a day. That about covers the core issues that I saw in the comments. Let's not mince words, I don't like modern Trek as much as I do classic Trek, but I've still enjoyed everything that's been released on some level, because at the end of the day, and despite what some people seem so insistent to claim, it is still Star Trek. And of course, you're welcome to have your own personal headcanon as to what is and isn't truly Trek, to cut out the dark bits, or the dystopian bits, or the characters you don't like. But I personally don't have the time or the inclination to micromanage my own entertainment to quite that degree. When it comes right down to it, Star Trek remains good fun sci-fi just as it always has been. Roll on multiple concurrent Star Trek series for the rest of my life for all I care. I'll watch it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you for listening to this particularly extended examination of the not real Trek arguments. I've been Adam from Passable Media. Please like, comment, share and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.